When we think about greatness, we usually picture these larger-than-life historical figures, right? The people who changed the world. We build statues to them, we teach their stories in schools. But here's the thing. When we put people on a pedestal for the great things they did, we sometimes miss the full and often really complicated picture of who they actually were. So today, let's pull back that curtain on some of history's most celebrated figures.
We have this sort of collective list, don't we? A roster of people our society has just decided are the greats. They're the ones who get quoted, revered, and held up as these shining examples of what humanity can achieve. Their names are basically shorthand for their incredible contributions.
It's such a simple question, but it's a really powerful one. When we stick that label, great, onto someone, what are we actually celebrating? Is it just their public achievements, or are we maybe missing a huge, huge part of the story?
And there's actually a name for this. It's a psychological thing called the halo effect. It's this mental shortcut we take where one amazing trait, like, say, a world-changing discovery or a wartime victory, creates this halo that makes us totally overlook or just downplay all their other, well, not-so-great qualities.
So, what's the big deal? What are the consequences when we let this happen? What crucial and sometimes really disturbing information do we miss when we're blinded by the light of someone's big achievements? Let's look at a few examples.
So first up, we're going to explore some figures whose public ideals, the very things that made them famous, were in direct, shocking conflict with their own personal beliefs and actions. To this day, Winston Churchill is seen as one of the greatest Britons who ever lived. And, for good reason. He was the powerhouse leader who stood up to the Nazis. He's a true icon of defiance against a hateful ideology.
But here's where it gets so jarring. While fighting the Nazis and their ideas of a master race, Churchill himself held some incredibly extreme views on racial hierarchy, with white Protestants right at the very top. And look, this wasn't just a product of his time. Even his own colleagues thought his ideas on race were totally fringe and pretty extreme.
And this wasn't just talk, it had devastating consequences. During the Bengal famine, while his own British subjects in India were starving to death, Churchill actively diverted massive food shipments to build up stockpiles in Europe. He justified it by blaming the victims, saying the famine was their own fault. By the time he finally relented and approved aid, up to 3 million of his own subjects were dead. It's just a shocking example of how these beliefs can lead to catastrophic actions.
Okay, now let's turn to another absolute giant of the 20th century, Mohandas Gandhi. His name is totally synonymous with peace, with the fight against oppression. The man inspired civil rights movements and freedom struggles all over the globe with his philosophy of nonviolent resistance.
And yet, and this is where it gets so hard to square, the man who fought so passionately against the oppression of his own people held these shockingly racist and derogatory views towards Black Africans. It's just a baffling contradiction, isn't it? To fight for your own people's dignity while actively denying it to others.
You've seen this face everywhere, right? On t-shirts, posters, maybe even a coffee mug. Che Guevara has become this kind of rock star image, a global symbol for rebellion and fighting the system.
But the reality behind that image? Well, it was brutal. Che established Cuba's very first concentration camps. He tortured and executed hundreds of people. And his targets were anyone he considered antisocial, which, ironically, included intellectuals, priests, gay people, and even the very hippies who might wear his face on a t-shirt today. And on top of all that, like others we've talked about, he also held deeply racist views.
Okay, next, let's look at some beloved figures from the world of arts and sciences. People whose celebrated public personas were hiding some deeply, deeply troubled private lives.
John Lennon, the man who gave the world songs like Imagine. He became this global icon for peace and love. But he himself, publicly, confessed to a totally different reality. He admitted that he was a man who beat women, cheated on his wife, and, in his own words, treated his first son like absolute garbage before just abandoning his family.
And then there's Albert Einstein, a name that is literally a synonym for genius. This guy unlocked the secrets of the universe: relativity, mass energy equivalence, space-time, you name it. But for all of that unbelievable intellectual brilliance, he failed and failed profoundly at basic human relationships.
After his wife found out he was having an affair with his own first cousin, he forced her to agree to this unbelievably cruel list of conditions just so she could stay for their children. Things like, "You will stop talking to me if I request it." Can you imagine?
She eventually had a nervous breakdown and he left her and their children anyway to go marry his cousin.
All right, now for a really different kind of case. What happens when a person's entire reputation is built on helping others, but that help might have actually caused more harm than good? This is the very complicated story of Mother Teresa.
So her organization received an incredible amount of money. We're talking tens of millions of dollars in donations every single year. You would think her facilities would be these state-of-the-art havens for the sick and the dying.
But what volunteers and journalists reported was something else entirely. Unhygienic facilities where needles were being reused on patients, even at the height of the AIDS epidemic. A shocking lack of actual doctors. Dying patients in agony were often given nothing more than an aspirin, and there were even reports of disabled children being tied to their beds.
So you have to ask, why? What was going on? Well, her own words give us a pretty big clue. Mother Teresa believed there was beauty in suffering, that it brought people closer to God. So her goal wasn't necessarily to alleviate pain with modern medicine, but to glorify it. And that framework really helps explain why, despite the millions in donations, the conditions in her facilities stayed so unbelievably poor.
So after all of this, what do we do with it? How are we supposed to reconcile these incredible achievements with this awful, awful behavior? Well, it starts with getting a more complete, a more nuanced view of what greatness really is.
And this right here is the key distinction. There is a huge difference between doing great things and being a great person. Society tends to go all in celebrating that first column, the world changers, the geniuses, the icons. But we often forget to value the second column, simple kindness, decency, integrity.
So while we can absolutely appreciate the great things these figures gave the world, maybe we can also save our true admiration for the great people in our own lives. The ones who may not have a historical legacy, but whose kindness and decency just make the world a better place every day.